Hello, everyone. Aboha Urban Studio welcomes you all to our sixth talk in the series of small cities informing urban theory. This share conversation series explores different facets of life in small cities in India, like urban growth, physical and cultural transformation of these cities, aspiration of youth, governance issues, and issues of social segregation in these small cities. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce our today's speaker, Srilata Sircar. Shilata is a lecturer in India and Global Affairs at King India Institute, King's College London. Prior to this, she has held positions at King College London as researcher, as postdoctoral researcher. She received her doctorate in human geography from Sweden in 2017. Working at the intersection of urban geography, South Asia studies, and postcolonial theory, her research interests include agrarian change, labor relations, political economic development, and caste and gender politics in smart cities infrastructures. Today, she's going to talk about her doctoral research, which was in West Bengal, and the title of the talk is "The Spatial Politics of Caste and Gender in Mufassil, India." Over to you, Shilpa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shilpa. It's really nice to be in this company and to present my work. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to try and share screen. Let me know if it works. Is that okay? Okay, great. Yeah, and hello to your audience as well. What I'm going to try and do today is spend about 30 minutes talking about a few different kind of vignettes and insights from my doctoral fieldwork, which was carried out in 2015, and offer some kind of very broad and just very broad interpretations that I arrived at in my doctoral thesis. Some of this work is already published. There is an article in the journal called Geoforum called "You Can Call It a Mufassil Town, but Nothing Less," which is a quote from one of my research participants. So yeah, if you want to actually read something published on this work, then that's available as well, and I'm happy to share afterwards. But for now, I'll just go straight ahead and start. So I know that earlier in this series, there was Kanu Charan Pradhan from Center for Policy Research who talked about census towns, and he's actually one of the pioneering figures writing about census towns in India. And this is a map that was created by him and his colleagues also at the Center for Policy Research that I'm happy to use. This is a map of all the census towns in India that came about in the year 2011. So very briefly, to introduce what census towns are for those members of our audience who were not there for Kanu's talk or are not aware of the concept. Census towns are the smallest size category of urban settlements in India. And the criteria for a place to be recognized or categorized as a census town is that there should be 5,000 population, 400 per square kilometer density of population, and at least 75% of the male workforce should be employed in non-agricultural work. And this definition tells us a lot about how the Indian state thinks about urbanization, which also aligns quite closely with how urban scholars and urban researchers and practitioners think about urbanization. So we think of it as a non-agricultural space where there is intense labor employment and economic activity, and it's a densely populated area with density of built environment as well. So keeping this criteria in mind, the census of 2011 revealed that there were 2,500 new centers or towns or kind of settlements that had been categorized as census towns in that cycle of census operations, which kind of gives this impression of an explosion of very rapid urbanization that suddenly took place between the previous census and this one, as if the decade of 2001 to 2011 was this, transformative decade when urbanization came big in India. And to put that in perspective, this number 2,500 was bigger than the total number of urban settlements that had been recorded in India from 1950s onwards. So that decade had increased the number by more than what the previous 5 decades had seen. So this was, seen as quite a kind of important observation and something to, look more into by urban scholars, demographers, etc. But then, as you probably will notice, it's been 10 years since then, and it's not that everybody has heard of census towns either, or that it has emerged, as sort of this big research agenda for urban studies in India or anything like that. And part of the presentation today will address that question of why. But I think this is something that I want to take as the entry point into discussing what I will discuss today, which is that there was this phenomenon of explosion of census towns as a category in the census. And that is what led me into doing the work that I eventually did. So if you look at this map, this over here, I hope you can see my cursor, but this little patch of orange over here in southern part of West Bengal will show you one of the kind of biggest hub of census towns. So
Srilata,
West
sorry
Bengal.
to interrupt you. Can you make it to a slideshow mode?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, great. So if you see this part over here, which is like this little hub of orange, it's in the southern part of West Bengal, covering a few districts, which are Purulia, Medinipur, and Bankura. And West Bengal was the state that had the highest number of new census towns, according to the census of 2011. And there's another corridor over here down in Kerala. But this kind of was already well known to urban demographers, especially because Kerala had been having that, a planned urban corridor for a while. But this hub here in West Bengal was kind of unforeseen. Nobody expected West Bengal to like emerge as this kind of leader of urbanization in that sense. So because of that, and also because I am from West Bengal and because I'm familiar with the language, etc., I decided to do my doctoral fieldwork in West Bengal. So here is a map of West Bengal. This big black dot here is the city of Calcutta, which is the capital, of course. And then all the small red dots are the census towns that I visited as part of my research. And the two kind of larger circle dots here are the census towns where I had extended periods of time doing kind of more extended qualitative fieldwork. So what I'm going to talk about today is one of these, which is what I'm referring to here as Gorbeta town. So it refers to this particular circle here. And if you see within the circle, there are actually two dots. So this, what I'm referring to as Gorbeta town, actually represents two census towns according to the census classification. And I'll explain why I'm referring to all of it as Gorbeta town and why it's important to keep that distinction in mind of what people refer to as Gorbeta town and what the census sees as Gorbeta census town, and the other one, which is Amlagora census town. So that's to give you a sort of orientation of what kind of places and spaces I'm going to be talking about now. So let me address the question, a kind of elephant in the room, which I think also on Twitter, there were some questions about this, which is what exactly is a Mufassil and why are we, using that terminology? So the word Mufassil comes to us from the early colonial period, from early colonial documentation, where it was essentially used to distinguish between the presidency and the agricultural hinterland around the presidency. And so this is a definition of the term Mufassil from a glossary of colloquial Anglo-Indian terminology, which says thus, so it's extracted from a larger kind of explanatory article, but it ends with, thus, if in Calcutta one talks of the Mufassil, he means anywhere in Bengal out of Calcutta. So Mufassil then is an inherently spatial category because it wants to make the spatial differentiation between the metropolitan presidency and the rest of the colonial terrain, if you will. And the fact that this terminology is still in use and was actively used by the people living in Gorbeta and is also actively used by people living in Calcutta, but to a lesser extent, tells us something about the imagination of space and the kind of spatial imaginary that census towns, emerge within, the imaginative landscape within which they operate. So I am born and raised in Calcutta, so I am, definitely part of the presidency and the metropolitan unit. And when I first arrived in Gorbeta, it was with this idea that this is a place that has dynamically transformed in the last 10 years, because that is what the census told me, right? That these are places that used to be urban and that used to be rural and have now become urban in 10 years and have kind of, come above that radar of the state, where the state is able to recognize it and classify it as a town. And when I arrived there, I realized that people who had been living there for generations kind of already knew that it wasn't news to them that they were now urban. They always imagined themselves as urban, but also in relation to Calcutta, with the knowledge that it is a different kind of urban as compared to Calcutta. And so they often use the term Mufassil town. And one of my respondents said to me, so in this discussion about, how would you go about classifying Gorbeta? Do you agree with the state classification? Do you agree with the census terminology? He said to me, he was actually one of the leading members of the Gorbeta Chamber of Commerce, which also we will hear about shortly. And he said, the minimum that you can say is a Mufassil town. You can call it a Mufassil town, but nothing less. And so there is obviously, in the public imagination, there is obviously a kind of variegated idea of the urban. There is the idea of an urban hierarchy, and there is a very clear understanding of where in that hierarchy this town is situated. And all of this was already there much before the census gave it any kind of classification and any kind of recognition as urban. And this is really important because once a settlement is recognized as a census town, that marks the beginning of the process when it can start to aspire towards having an urban governance system. So either having a town panchayat or a municipal council, and having an urban plan, having a budget that supports an urban population. All of these things can only start to happen once it has been recognized as urban in the census. But that doesn't mean that this is a kind of, process that is set in stone that will immediately happen because the census has now recognized you. That is not at all the case. And I did the census came out in 2011. I did the field work in 2015, and we are now in 2021. And Gorbeta still doesn't have either a town panchayat or a municipal council. Far from it. It is still within the rural governance mechanism of the gram panchayat, block panchayat, and the district panchayat, which is present across India. And it still operates within that limited budget and limited kind of tax raising powers and limited planning powers. So it still has limited autonomy in defining what kind of spatial entity it is going to be. But the recognition has come from the census. But then that census recognition is a very delayed kind of recognition, because in the eyes of the people, it has always been a town for of several decades at least. And the minimum that you can call it is a Mufassil town. And so I decided to go with this terminology and frame these kinds of spatial settings as Mufassil India, where there is this sort of tension between what the official legislative processes and the official classification processes see it as and want it to be, as opposed to what the people living there and the communities who make place out of that space have in mind. So having addressed that question of what is a Mufassil and why are we using that terminology, let's get into the spatial politics of caste and gender. So this is a map that I created through a combination of processes. So I realized soon after arriving in Gorbeta that what is referred to as Gorbeta Census Town in the spreadsheet that I had is very different from what is referred to as Gorbeta Town by the people who live there. And to cut a long story short, what I realized was that this brown area over here is the census unit that is referred to as Gorbeta Census Town. And this brown unit here is the census unit that is referred to as Amlagura Census Town. And these are just kind of two lines on an Excel sheet. That is what it was to me before I arrived there. There was no way to actually know that they are kind of spatially contiguous as built environment, which I only realized after going there, which is to say that this entire area that is marked in this lighter shade of yellow, beige, I don't know what to call it, but this entire kind of colored up area is a continuous built up environment. And it's like it's a compact spatial unit that people perceive as one continuous settlement, as one town, which is referred to as Gorbeta town. And then Amlagora is referred to as sort of a neighborhood within that town or a part of the town. So in that sense, when in course of this presentation, as well as in my PhD, when I refer to Gorbeta town, I'm not referring only to what is classified or recognized in the census, but to all of this spatial unit. And so there is an Amlagora village panchayat and there is a Gorbeta village panchayat, and these are the two key administrative units that are governing usage of space in that area. And so what I did was, I want to talk a little bit about the process of making this map, because that gives us an entry point into talking about the spatial politics of caste. So one of the first things I did after arriving there was, and after I had realized that this is actually the spatial unit I'm looking at, and I have to keep my Excel sheet aside and actually, engage with this. One of the things I did was to plot all the kind of important markers of space that people interacted with on a daily basis that were, really important to people. So landmarks, but not necessarily only in terms of government institutions and such, but, landmarks that are part of the everyday lives of the people who use that space. So we have here everything that's listed over here. So you have the 2 village panchayats, you have the Gorbeta court, which is over here. You have the rural hospital. You have the panchayat offices, and the temple. So this one is the temple over here. So the temple was really important, and every time I asked people, where do you think Gorbeta begins and ends, very often they would say, oh, it ends at the temple. That's like the extent of it. And in the imagination of the people, they would say, yeah, the temple, either that is where it starts or that is where it ends, based on, where in Gorbeta they are located. But then, and I'm going to show a picture of the temple shortly. Yeah, so this is the temple. So this is a picture that I took of the temple from this area over here, which I realized was the Dalit neighborhood. And there's a very stark difference between the built environment of on this side of the temple and the built environment on that side of the temple. So on this side of the temple, you have concrete houses, very well maintained, probably pretty old, like at least 40, 50 years old. Some of them almost like mansions, the cars in the garage and that sort of thing. And on the other side, it was completely rural, mud houses, mud and clay houses, temporary structures, possibly structures that need rebuilding after every season of monsoon and flooding and such. And then that was the kind of Dalit neighborhood. And it consisted of, 4 kind of mini neighborhoods within it, that each of which was homogeneous in terms of the particular Dalit caste that lived there. So there you have this kind of segregation of space by caste quite clearly, but you also have this idea that the city ends at the temple and the Dalit neighborhood is not really seen as part of the town, or the urban nature of the town is not, extended to that. However, the economy of the town is entirely dependent on the Dalit labor, and the more the Dalit labor tries to take itself away from dependence on the town economy and have its own agrarian self-sufficiency, the more the town becomes dependent on Adivasi labor from the rest of the area. So this area in general, which is southern Bengal, and the 3 districts I'm talking about here are Purulia, Bankura, and West Medinipur. They have substantial Adivasi populations, and it's right next to Jharkhand, so it's part of it's like extended Chota Nagpur area. So it's there has been a long time kind of Adivasi presence in the area. So the more the Dalits retract themselves from being dependent on the town economy, the more the town becomes dependent on Adivasi labor from the larger agricultural hinterland. And so that kind of gives us a picture of not only the caste-based segregation of space, but also the caste-based segregation of economic activity, which I will shortly elaborate on. So that's the nature of the space. And after having visited each of these landmarks and plotting the landmarks, I then did a number of transit walks with different members, different kinds of residents. So panchayat members, traders, students, working women. And in these transit walks, I tried to mark the limits of how far they need to travel each day for, in their everyday lives in course of living and working there. And based on a kind of aggregation of all of these transit walks, I then plotted the boundaries of the town. And this, of course, is not an official boundary at all. It's not, recognized by in any document anywhere. But this is the kind of notional map of, what the town is to the people there. And then I started using this, and then I plotted all of that in GIS, and then I took printouts and started using that in my interviews with people to point towards, what are the places that we are talking about, etc. And my methodology mainly consisted of doing oral history interviews, business history interviews, and this mapping exercise. Right. So a little bit more about the caste-based segregation of space here. So we have the Dalit settlement here, which is largely an agrarian settlement, and almost completely landless, but with a few few Dalit families trying to buy land or consolidate land holdings by pooling money, etc. So this neighborhood here, which is the one referred to as Gorbita City, which is the one that the Gorbita census town, which is recognized in the census. That area is actually populated by a landed elite consisting of Brahmin and Rajput families from actually northern and central India who had migrated to the Bengal Sultanate to work as accountants and to work in the royal court, to work as security guards, to work as bodyguards to various important people in the Bengal Sultanate. And then they had settled here because they had been given land. And those kind of land tenures were respected by the British colonial regime as well. So they held on to the land, and they actually accumulated more land in the process of the permanent settlement, which was the kind of big land intervention in colonial Bengal that kind of reorganized how land is held and cultivated and who has what kind of rights to land, and also resulted in massive disenfranchisement of Dalit Adivasi Bahujan groups. So they had managed to both receive landholding and accumulate more land over the course of the centuries. And they had been settled there for a very long time, and they considered themselves, quote unquote, almost Bengali. So they still kept their North Indian surnames. So Bajpai, Shukla, Mishra, these were some of the common surnames. But they, and they also spoke different versions of Hindustani at home, but they were extremely fluent in Bengali. Many had their education in Bengali and were very active in the village panchayat and in local politics, and thought of themselves as well integrated into Bengali society, which of course they were. Then we have here this other kind of slightly darker yellow area that I have marked out, which was the other moja. And the moja is like, it's a census block, I would say. It's like the unit at which the census is carried out. So Gorbita Moja becomes Gorbita census town. This Moja, it's called Lapuria, and this is not identified as a census town, even though this is the part where most of the recent extension of built environment and recent economic activity had taken place. And this is where also the village panchayat offices. And so when I actually arrived here and I said, I want to look at Gorbita Moja, which is now Gorbita census town, and they said, but why? And I said, because in the last 10 years, it has, transformed, it has become urban. And they said, no, that has been the same for at least 150 years. What has transformed is actually this part, which apparently is not recognized as a census town. But this is where a lot of the landed elite, Bengali landed elite, also Brahmin Kayastha groups, who had left their land holdings in the villages, mainly because of Maoist activity and Maoist threat, and had moved into this town area and had constructed homes and had essentially withdrawn from agriculture and gone into other kinds of economic activities, mainly potato processing. And so the kind of agrarian economy of this place is entirely anchored by the potato crop. And the main economic activities at that time were potato processing, cold storage, potato trading, and such. And one of the traders told me that if something goes wrong in Gorbita town, then Calcutta and Bhubaneswar will not have potatoes to eat, kind of signifying the importance of this space in the regional economy as well. So yeah, so that is the kind of caste segregation, the spatial segregation of caste, both in terms of elite caste and Dalit caste, but also kind of segregation within the elite caste as well. Right. So this is the picture taken of the temple from the other side, which is from the Dalit settlement side. And here I want to talk a bit about how do the Dalit residents of Gorbeta town or the fringes of Gorbeta town think about urbanity or urbanness. And so this is a quotation from, these are all pseudonyms, of course, but from a lady I interviewed who was a Dalit caste lady who I interviewed, who had lived there essentially all her life. So she was married when she was about 10 years old and had arrived there. And at this point, she was 65-ish. So she'd lived there almost all her life. And she said, in a way, it is a town. There is a court and a college and a hospital. Which village would have all of these? But the town ends right there, pointing towards the temple that I showed a picture of. Would it be correct if I say I live in a town? Like, look around yourself and tell me. So it was really, she, threw the question back at me. So my question to her was, do you think Gorbeta is a town? If so, when do you think it became a town? And she said, well, yes, it is a town, but do I live in it? Is my part of Gorbeta town? Why don't you look around and tell me? And it makes perfect sense to, throw that question back at me, because we were actually sitting, on the floor of the courtyard, and we were surrounded by kind of almost dilapidated, broken structures, homes that were in a very precarious state. And it was actually soon going to be the time of the year when everybody kind of restructures or reinforces the structures of their home once the monsoon season has passed. So that kind of, infrastructural precarity, of course, goes against the idea of what urban areas should be, even though now, even in metropolitan and kind of mega city areas, the similar kind of infrastructural precarity becomes visible to us. And while that also has its own, caste and gender and class dimensions, of course, in this case, it was particularly stark, the kind of the level of precarity in terms of infrastructure. How am I doing on time, Shilpa? I can't see the time when I go into a PowerPoint this
you have about 10 more minutes.
Okay, great. Right. So we have here a picture of the Gorbeta Chamber of Commerce, which again kind of flies in the face of this whole idea of, oh, this has only recently become a town and it's doesn't even have an urban governance system yet. But it has a Chamber of Commerce, and it's a Chamber of Commerce that has been around for a while. And the Chamber of Commerce is sort of the body that represents the socioeconomic interests of the caste elite, most of which is involved in the potato processing and potato trading activities. And their main kind of agenda in terms of intervening into policy had nothing to do with this urban-rural classification. They were not interested in it. They did not think that becoming a municipal council or a municipal corporation would be of any benefit to them. In fact, it might bring in more kind of tax measures and building restrictions that might actually go against their socioeconomic interests. Their main agenda was to get Gorbeta recognized or to make Gorbeta the subdivisional headquarter. And this is a category that is completely absent from most urban studies literature, as also from most actually agrarian studies literature, because it's a kind of old colonial category that really doesn't play a very significant role in the policy regime of today. But the subdivisional headquarter is the place where the main kind of bureaucratic offices have to be located. So their main concern was, we want the banks and the tax collection agencies and any kind of government agency that we need to visit and get permissions from to be located in Gorbeta, so that we are not spending our time taking train rides, going to these other places, spending half a day waiting in their offices, etc. So that was their main agenda, which again is kind of completely different from how urban researchers or urban practitioners go around, framing what kind of policy interventions are required for urban futures. So here is a quote from one of these elite caste cold storage owners, talking about how integral the potato trade is to the economy, but also the kind of many different linkages that economy has with spaces outside of Gorbeta. So he says, I'll tell you how the trade is done. Say you have a job with a monthly salary of 20 or 30,000, you can save 5,000 a month, and after a while you will have 50 or 60,000 or even a lakh to spare. Say that year the potatoes are being bought and put into the store at the rate of 30,000 per truck. You will obviously have a trader friend. You just call him and say, why don't you put in 2 trucks of potatoes for me? I'll give you 30,000 for now, and the remaining 30 you'll have to borrow. So the friend will put in 2 trucks of potatoes for you in the cold store. Now, when you decide to sell it in the market, you will make a profit or a loss. But your friend will trust you because they have known you since birth. If it doesn't work out one year, it will work out in the next. And that's how there is a trader in every family. So the families that were living in the Gorbit, the two kind of elite caste parts of the town, every family had most of its members living either in Calcutta or in another metropolitan city with formal sector salaried jobs. And the convention was to have usually one sibling staying in Gorbita town and taking care of the agricultural enterprise of the family, because all of these are landowning families, or most of these are landowning families that still, are involved in agriculture through sharecropping, or through tenancy farming and sharecropping, or by hiring agricultural laborers. But so there's a flow of capital that happens from the metropolitan areas back into here through this potato trade. And most of it is hinged on these networks, caste-based networks. And so the capital never kind of goes outside of the caste community is the main point of what I'm trying to say. And one's ability to continue to profit from that capital circuit and to be a part of this, urban Mufassil economy is also predicated upon one's, belonging and membership in this caste community. So I'm going to go now very quickly. This is actually the picture of the house where I did the interview with Geeta Dom, who I quoted earlier. I'm actually going to go on now to the gender part of my talk very quickly. So within this this whole process of running this kind of mixed economy, so women's role in that is kind of it needs a bit of excavation to find out where are the women in all of this, because the public space in the towns were very masculine, and my best bet for being able to find women when they are alone and being able to talk to them was to basically hang out at the puchka stall, which is the golgappa stall, just an hour or so before sunset, because that was the time when women came out in groups and wanted to have this snack. And that was the time when I could, talk to them, especially the elite caste women. And one of the phenomenon that I noticed was that there were a lot of elite caste women, or not just Brahmin caste women, but also kind of mid-ranking agrarian castes who had migrated from local nearby villages, or sometimes a bit distant villages as well, to come and live in Gorbita, because Gorbita had a college, and also because it provided B.Ed degrees and other kind of teacher training and kind of practical degrees that then would facilitate their entry into the formal sector job market. So this, for example, is something called an education center, which basically the job of this place is to provide a physical space for people to come and write exams, and to provide all the kind of necessary paperwork for registering people into university courses, for registering them for exams, for making question papers available, for making mark sheets available, transcripts available, that sort of thing. But there was no actual teaching taking place over here. The teaching was taking place entirely through distant mode, or sometimes even through online mode. So there was like a thriving economy of internet cafes as well. And so there were a lot of women who came and lived as paying guests, usually in the houses of Brahmin families, and took part in this kind of education economy. And it proved incredibly hard to actually be able to interview any of these women at their place of residence, because the Brahmin hostel runners, as they thought of themselves, took it upon themselves to govern not only the movement of the women, but also their like social interactions of all kinds. So in some of the hostels, for example, there was a rule for women to not have mobile phones after a certain time in the evening. Their mobile phones were regularly checked by the women of the household to see who they were calling and who they were in contact with. And it was all kind of framed around this idea of the big city, not the big city, but like the bad city should not have a corrupting influence on these innocent women from the village. And the Brahmin families saw it as, a role as their guardianship to ensure that no woman was corrupted in this process of trying to become part of urban life in the town. So I'm going to end by sharing some snapshots from an interview that I did with one of the very few women entrepreneurs who I met. She only wanted to be recognized as Mrs. Agarwal, and she was running a textile and garments, a very small textile and garment store that was part of her family business. That was kind of her family business in the sense that all of her family members were involved in this sector of work, but this particular shop was her own enterprise that she was running independently, because other enterprises that had been started by her husband and her husband's brothers had failed and tanked. And so she had kind of taken the reins in her hands, and she had procured a loan, a microcredit loan. She was using makeshift space that was rent free but was like part of her residence, and so she was entrepreneurial in many senses. But her husband always came and sat in the shop with her, and I only got to interview her for 1 hour in the afternoon one day when her husband had gone for a nap. And she was extremely she did it with a lot of trepidation, and she refused to give me her first name, and she only wanted to be recognized as Mrs. Agarwal. So in her narrative of what kind of place Gorbita is, she said, when I came here, and she had been married like maybe about a bit over 30 years at that point. So she says, when I came here, this place was a total village, or dehat, as she called it. There was nothing here. It was not even a place where you could see people out on the streets after 7 p.m. And she was actually born and raised in Asansol, which is a kind of second tier city, now actually really big, thanks to Babul Shuprio. I guess everybody knows of Asansol. So she was from there, and she had been married off into this family in Gorbita. The moment the sun set, people would lock themselves up indoors. In the beginning, I was habituated to town life. So in the beginning, I did not like this place at all, having to stay at home and everything revolving around the home. Today, now, after she came into this business, which she had been running for about 10 years at this point, she said that her idea of what the town is or what it means is kind of shaped by the interactions that she has outside of the town, where she has to travel to procure goods for her business, and engage in various kinds of negotiations with wholesalers. And she said, today there are several problems. Where I go to buy my stocks, they just see me and from the very beginning think that is a woman and immediately say that there is nothing to sell. And the Mahajan would just see me and say, there are no goods to sell. And yet, this is a kind of mobility map of all the different places that Mrs. Agarwal travels to on the regular. At least, once every 2 or 3 months, she goes to each of these places. So this here is Asansol, this here is Durgapur, this here is Arra, down here is Kolkata. So she has actually quite a wide range of mobility, which kind of is a little bit in contrast to what in other kind of working women in metropolitan centers would have by and large. So based on all of this, I have kind of 3 broad submissions from my PhD thesis. The first, of course, is that there is a huge dissonance between official classification and lived experience when it comes to small town India, Mufassil India. And the second is that urbanization is not a radically transformative force, but it's rather a negotiated state of existence marked by various forms of tensions around caste and gender. So, of course, caste and gender relations are not the same as they would have been in a completely agrarian setting. But at the same time, there's no kind of this radical rupture of caste and gender relations that, urbanization just transforms altogether. But, rather they unravel every day through these little processes of tensions. And so Mufassil India represents a state of what I call dynamic continuity, where of course there is dynamism in terms of the built environment and the policy frameworks, but this dynamism is heavily reliant on the continuity of the underlying caste and gender order. So it is still very much stable in terms of who is the landed elite and who has no land ownership and no land rights. It's still very determined by by patriarchy and the norms of patriarchy and who is allowed to have access to what space. But still, the changes coming about in that are reflected in the built environment, and they are reflected in the everyday places or everyday life experiences of the people, but they are not this kind of drastic rupture. So the fundamental structure is very stable. And it's based on the stability of that fundamental structure that all of the other kind of dynamism is visible to us otherwise. So I'll stop with that and take your questions now.
Thank you so much, Srilata, for this very embedded and very rich conversation about Mufassil town. We are open for questions now. Also, we have Mr. Abhijit Kaplish with us, who is Municipal Commissioner Abohar. Yeah, so we are open for the questions if anybody in the audience would like to ask. So meanwhile, people are forming their questions. I have one question right in front. Then you're discussing about how you would meet women only at the puchka stalls in the evening, and they would be staying in the PG hostels run by the Brahmins. How were you navigating in the city when you were doing your field work? As in, like, what were your ways of sort of finding a place to stay in the city or doing the fieldwork process?
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. So I stayed at this place that is called a lodge. They call themselves a lodge. And there are a few of these lodges in the town, both this one and the other town that I stayed at, which were basically constructed. So this is also one of the kind of emerging sectors of economic activity, which is to have eateries and places to stay.
Mm-hmm.
And this is mainly geared towards agricultural salesmen, so people trying to pitch particular fertilizers and pesticides and seeds and things like that, or people trying to pitch agricultural machinery. So I was the only woman that I think probably had ever lived in the lodge. Definitely the only woman who had lived there by myself. But the owner of the lodge was somebody who had also, whose family had moved from a very kind of agricultural setting and had come into this land through various, processes of like family ties and some amount of bribery involved, but had kind of, landed on this, piece of real estate where they set up this lodge. And he was very interested in the project. Because when I said that I wanted to understand the history of, small towns, like how do small towns come about? How does a settlement go from being an agricultural village to a Mufassil town, let's say? He understood, my interest in that. He said, oh yes, this is not something that, nobody's ever come to ask us that, like nobody is interested in that. So yes, you can stay. In the other town, actually, I did not find a place to stay. So the other town that I went to is called Jhati Pahari, which is in Bankura district. And I did not actually find a place to stay. I tried with the village panchayat members. I said, can I just stay like within your family home, like just for a few days? And everybody was very skeptical of the idea of having this woman, unmarried, and, kind of not knowing where to place me in their scheme of things. So they were very skeptical of this. So I actually ended up staying in Bankura town, which is the district headquarter, at the state-run kind of, what is it called, transit house. Yeah. So I stayed there, and then I commuted to the town every day, which was like 2 hours each way. So yeah.
Your entire narrative also sort of resonates with what we experienced in Abohar also. Not really like it's a now it's a municipal corporation, but till then it was a municipal town. It has been a town since very long. Even in the colonial times, it was developed as a town, as a mandi town, and then eventually evolved with the coming of the cotton industry and other things. But many things of how agricultural relationships with the town sort of were functioning in the Mufassil area of Bengal, and how they are sort of speaking to the other parts of the country was also sort of very much evident and interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience?
I think there's a comment from Mr. Kaplish actually. It says, lovely presentation. Love hearing about the field work. Thank you so much, Mr. Kaplish. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Anu.
Hi, Srilata.
Hi.
Can I ask Shilpa?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Very interesting kind of confluence of both caste and gender, how they play out. And I was wondering how, for example, you spoke briefly about the Adivasi people that come into this area, how gender or caste is perceived in relation to them, especially gender, in the sense that do women also come, or do they face some of the same constraints that you talked about with more upper caste women, and how does that work? In my also looking at like earlier work, I mean, I was the oft-cited Partha Chatterjee and his address, how he addresses the women question. So if you could speak briefly about how, so he obviously is talking in the context of Calcutta, but more predominantly, larger, more urbanized centers in India. So would something like that now hold for what you are studying in the Mufassil towns, or would that be different? And how so?
Yeah. Yeah, so I'll start by talking about Adivasi women and their role in the kind of local economy. So there was a clear kind of gendered nature of labor, in the sense that there was seasonal labor that was required to make the cold storages operational. So, the kind of the physical labor of loading potatoes to truck, unloading them, taking them up the stairs into the cold storage, that kind of work, that was done almost entirely by Adivasi men, not just from Bengal, but also from Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. And they came seasonally, and there were makeshift accommodations for them, very low quality, of course, but this was seasonal work that was done entirely by Adivasi men. Um, Adivasi women did not come as migrants from other places, but Adivasi women who were local, or fairly local, I would say, maybe like there are these shared autos that run, so it would be like maybe 30 to 45 minutes on that. So that level of local, not the immediate setting. They would come to work as domestic workers in many of the houses of the elite neighborhoods, and the younger ones were working in some oil mills and rice mills as well. Um, Not so much in Gorbeta, but in Jhanti Pahari, there were so what the cold storages are to Gorbeta, the rice mills and oil mills are to that town. So that is the core economic activity. So there were quite a few Adivasi women working in the oil mill and rice mills, where the nature of the work was also considered to be like more delicate and not as kind of manually demanding, or like physically demanding, I guess. And they were also kind of, the mill owners said that they are the good workers. They said, so there's of course this narrative of the shortage of labor because labor has become so demanding, and oh no, we have to now pay a wage, can you imagine? And oh no, they actually demand more higher wages. That kind of anxiety around labor relations was very predominant, also because this sector is also kind of, it's a very stagnant sector. It's not the kind of Punjab agrarian economy that has a lot of cash flowing through it. It's a very stagnant. It's a kind of struggling sector, I would say. Every now and then they would have to make another request to the chief minister for some doles and subsidies and things like that. So within that context, there was a lot of anxiety about how are we going to procure labor, and within that setting, Adivasi women were seen as the good labor who would just come and do the work and go and not create trouble and not strike and not ask for higher wages and that sort of thing. Yeah, so your question about like how do we theorize that? I think the general distinction between like Bhadra Mahila, as they're called, like just elite caste women, and working class Dalit Adivasi women is very stark, and it's very visible, and I don't think there's a way to negate that at all. But in terms of how does that differ from like metropolitan to Mufassil areas? I think um, I have to maybe think about that a bit. I saw all of this from a very kind of agrarian labor relations perspective. So, I did not, and maybe that's a very kind of truncated perspective at my end, but I did not see this, from a urban labor relations perspective. I saw it as, okay, so this would have been working in the fields. It just happens to be in a mill now, but the relations are the same. And, the kind of negotiations that take place are also the same. Yeah.
I was thinking of the last quote you had from Mrs. Agarwal, and in relation to Alpa Shah's work with the brick kiln workers, and how they find that space liberating. So, in the context of and I found it very interesting how this narrative that you talked about of the control over women, so that this corrupting influence of the city does not
Yeah.
get to them. So in that context, the same space, I wonder if it is liberating for a particular class of women, whereas it is constraining for another class of women. That's kind
Yeah.
of where I was getting at. Yeah, you know
Yeah.
the details.
Yeah, I think actually I would argue that, even the liberation is like the state of tension. Like there is, no like absolute, this is liberating, this is constraining. I think even for the women who were living in these hostels under these very policed, norms and conditions, even for them, it was a liberating experience because, it was their foot into the formal economy. It was their foot into getting a degree that would then translate into a job, hopefully. So, it's a kind of liberation, it's like a conditional liberation. But I wouldn't take away from, their aspiration to that liberation at all. I think the fact that these hostels exist makes it possible for them to then come live in the town and, undertake this work in a way that would have been far more demanding if they were living in the villages, because the commute itself would have been, really taxing on them in all kinds of ways, also in terms of, harassment and such. So in that sense, it's definitely a liberatory space. There's no doubt about that. And in the sense of like urban transformations being like urbanization being this force of transformation, in that sense definitely holds, but it's still very reliant on the foundation of a Brahminical patriarchy, essentially. Yeah.
Thanks.
Do we have more questions from the audience? I think people are trying to absorb the talk. Yeah.
Yeah, I hope it wasn't too disjointed. It was, I skipped over some of the things that I also wanted to say, but that is how it always goes.
But yeah, it was connected, and I think I wish I wouldn't have sort of like a time slot on the timed your talk, so we could have went on for a few more minutes beyond the 10 minutes which I sort of told you in between.
No, that's okay. So usually the reason I don't go into the slideshow mode is because I can look at the time and time
Yeah.
myself better. But it's a nicer experience to do the talk when it's in slideshow, because everything is more visible and you're not distracted by anything, but you lose track of time.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Just another question in terms of when you're trying to map the extents, the notional map which you created with your respondents and their narratives. Um, was it intentional not to overlap with the Google Earth image of the place, or I was just wondering that the map which you created, a overlay of a Google Earth image would also show certain spatial topographical features
Yeah.
or changes in the built form around, or how the agricultural lands are being sort of spaced out or distributed along these boundaries, or how people perceive these boundaries.
Yeah. So when I created the map, I did, overlay it on Google Earth. Um, and this image that I showed, it's actually extracted from my PhD thesis. So I realized that for the purpose of the thesis and for kind of clarity of image, I needed to not have the bottom layer of Google Earth, just for like visual clarity. So in the thesis and even in the publications, I have separate images showing this is what I mapped and this is what it looks like, from the satellite. But yeah, you're right. That would have given a sense of. There was actually this study or like this research project, a French research project, which was trying to find sort of a global criteria for defining urbanization. Because this problem of the category of urban is like very different in different countries, what population is considered or what density is considered. So this project was trying to come up with a globally applicable definition to have some kind of, transnational comparability. And they arrived at this idea that if you have continuous built up area with less than 200 meters of, distance between gap between the built environment, then that would be classified as urban. And with that classification, the number went up to, I think, 55% of India would be then considered urban, which in the census, I think it's at about 31 or 33% right now. So there's a massive underestimation of, again, depending on, what criteria you employ and to what ends. But there is, by all considerations, definitely from the perspective of the people who actually live there, there's a massive underestimation of the scale of urbanization and the nature of urbanization as well.
Yeah. Do we have more questions? Any thoughts, comments from the talk, from the audience?
Hi, Shilpa. Hello, this is Harshali.
Yeah, Harshali, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Srilata. Yeah, this
Hi.
was really excellent presentation. Yeah, actually, I'm also working in the same area. I'm working on Census Town in Maharashtra, like Lasalgaon, which is Asia's largest onion market. And where, like, I noticed that there is a difference between day population and night population. There is like floating population because of migration and because of even, like for other not non-agricultural activities, because of non-agricultural activities in the town. So did you notice that sort of like a very visible difference during day and night in the town? Yeah, so
No,
just like how was like
yeah.
exactly migration phenomena, because as you mentioned, this is not like Punjab, like, very vibrant agricultural economy, and not like even Maharashtra, because even Maharashtra has that like very vibrant agricultural economy. So did you notice that kind of difference?
Not at that scale. So I think the shift would be more noticeable, like in terms of the day and night difference, it would be more noticeable in which part of the town. So I'll just go back and put up the map again. So in this one, so this is the part of the town that is more kind of commercial. That is where the vegetable market, food market, the shopping complex, those kinds of structures were. So this is the part that would be more densely populated during the day, and then these are the more residential parts, so those would become more densely populated during the night. So in that sense, there was a slight shift, I would say, but not a massive shift in terms of like a huge influx of workers, because most of the migrant workers were coming for seasonal work. So once they were there, they would stay for about 2 months or so, and then they would go back. And I don't think I really measured that, change of population very well, so I can't speak to it in detail. But in terms of day and night, it was just, like movement of population within the town rather than, from outside of the town. Yeah, so that was my experience in this context. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So if we don't have any more questions, we can call it a day. Thank you, Srilata, for joining us for a wonderful talk and engaged discussion about the Mufassil towns in West Bengal. Thank you so much, people who have joined us for this conversation as well. Thank you so much all.